She had spent 2 years trying to reach that horse. 2 years of early mornings, of standing at the fence with her hands open and her voice low, of walking away rejected, of going back anyway. 2 years of grief so heavy it had changed the way she moved through the world. Slower, quieter, like a woman who had learned that sudden movements cost too much. And on the morning she finally felt his breath on her palm, warm, hesitant, real. The sky to the east turned orange. Not the orange of sunrise, the orange of fire. And everything she had fought so hard to build, every fragile, beautiful thing, was suddenly in the path of something that did not care about second chances. This is the story of Marlo Dean, a widow, a woman, and the most important morning of her life. Now, before we go any further, I have to ask you something because this story hit me in a place I wasn't expecting. Have you ever worked towards something so quietly, so patiently, for so long, that when it finally happened, you almost couldn't believe it was real? That moment of finally, just before everything threatened to fall apart. That's exactly what this story is about, and I promise you, by the time we reach the end, you are going to feel it in your chest. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because we tell stories like this every week. Drop a like if you believe in second chances, and I want you to leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The town of Carver's Bluff, Montana, sits in a valley so narrow that in winter the sun only reaches the main road for about 4 hours a day. The mountains crowd in from both sides like old men hunching over a conversation, and the wind that moves through the pass carries a particular kind of cold, the kind that doesn't just chill your skin, it gets into the space between your thoughts and settles there. Marlo Dean had lived on the edge of that valley for 11 years. She and her husband Crispin had bought the property together. 42 acres of dry grass, a leaning barn, a farmhouse that smelled like cedar and old paint, and a creek that ran clear in spring and nearly disappeared by August. They had plans. Big, sprawling, beautiful plans. Horses, a small operation. Nothing commercial, just enough animals to justify getting up before dawn, which was the way both of them liked to live. Crispin died on a Tuesday in October, 2 years before this story takes place. He was 44 years old. A cardiac event, the doctors called it, a phrase so clinical and bloodless that Marlo had nearly laughed in the hospital hallway when they said it. A cardiac event, as if the heart were a venue, as if grief was something scheduled. She did not sell the property. That surprised people. Her sister Wren, who drove up from Billings the week after the funeral, had gently suggested that maybe a fresh start somewhere smaller, somewhere that didn't carry so many memories, might be the healthier choice. Marlo had listened to all of it. She had nodded at the right moments, and then she had stayed, because the land was his, because the land was hers, because leaving felt like agreeing that it was over. And some stubborn, unreasonable part of her was not ready to agree to that. She kept 3 horses through the first winter, 2 older mares she'd had for years, gentle and familiar, animals that required tending without demanding anything emotionally complicated. And then, in the spring of the second year, a man named Cutter called her from a property 2 valleys over. Cutter ran a loose kind of rescue operation, more informal than official, the kind of thing that happened because he had land and couldn't say no to a suffering animal rather than because anyone had asked him to do it. He had a horse, he said, a 5-year-old Appaloosa stallion, dark coat with a pale blanket across the hindquarters, white speckling like frost on a window. Beautiful animal, but badly traumatized. Previous owner had used methods Cutter wouldn't describe in detail over the phone, only saying that the horse had learned to associate human hands with pain and hadn't unlearned it yet. Nobody wanted him. He'd been passed through 3 situations in 8 months, each one ending in someone getting hurt or giving up. Cutter had kept him 6 weeks and made some progress, but he had too many animals and not enough hours. "I thought of you," Cutter said. "I don't know why exactly, Maybe because you're patient. Maybe because you're not trying to prove anything to anybody right now. Marlowe was quiet on the phone for a long moment. "What's his name?" she asked. "Previous owners called him different things. I just call him Ghost." She drove out the next morning. Ghost was everything Cutter had described, and more complicated than description could capture. He stood in the far corner of the paddock, weight shifted back, head low, watching her approach with eyes that weren't angry so much as exhausted. The kind of eyes that had stopped expecting anything good and were simply waiting to be disappointed again. Marlowe recognized that look. She had seen it in her own mirror enough times to know exactly what it meant. She didn't try to approach him that day. She just stood at the fence for 40 minutes, not looking directly at him, letting him get used to the fact that she was there and not demanding anything. When she left, she told Cutter she'd take him. Cutter looked at her for a long moment. "You sure?" "No," she said honestly, "but I'm taking him anyway." That was the beginning. Ghost arrived at Marlowe's property on a grey April morning, loaded into a trailer with the kind of anxious, coiled stillness that told you the animal inside had learned that stillness was safer than movement. When the trailer door opened and the ramp came down, he backed out slowly, hooves finding the gravel, nostrils working the new air. He stood in the yard for a full minute just smelling things, the grass, the barn, the other horses somewhere inside, the cedar smoke coming from the farmhouse chimney. Then he looked at Marlowe, not at the fence or the sky or the mountains, at her specifically, direct and assessing, the way a creature looks at something when it's trying to decide whether that thing is a threat. She stood still, hands at her sides, eyes soft and unfocused. He looked away first, which in the language of horses is a kind of answer. She set him up in the paddock farthest from the barn, enough space to move, enough distance from the other horses that he wouldn't feel crowded, a run-in shed in the corner where he could get out of the weather. She put his feed at the fence line and retreated before he would approach it. She did this for the first 2 weeks without variation. She was teaching him something very specific. I bring good things, and then I leave. I do not stay and demand payment. Her neighbor, Rowena, stopped by in the 3rd week, leaning on the fence and watching Ghost circle the far end of the paddock like something pacing a perimeter. "He's beautiful," Rowena said. "Terrified, but beautiful." "Most terrified things are," Marlowe said. Rowena had been Marlowe's closest friend in Carver's Bluff for years, a broad-shouldered woman in her 60s who had ranched this valley her whole life and had the kind of unhurried confidence that comes from knowing your land, like a language. She had been one of the few people after Crispin's death who hadn't tried to fix Marlowe, who had simply shown up, done practical things, and not required Marlowe to perform recovery for an audience. "How are you doing?" Rowena asked. "Not about the horse, about Marlowe." "Better when I'm out here," Marlowe said. That was the truest thing she'd said to anyone in months. Because it was true. Something about working with Ghost was doing something to her internal weather. Not healing her exactly, not the dramatic kind of transformation people described in memoirs. Something quieter, more like recalibration. Standing at the fence every morning, focusing all of her attention on reading one animal's body language, learning to separate her own emotion from what she was projecting onto the space between them. It required a kind of presence she hadn't practiced since Crispin died. Grief, she had discovered, is profoundly self-referential. It pulls your attention inward constantly, replaying, rehearsing, revisiting. The horse required the opposite. The horse required her to be entirely outward-facing, entirely tuned to what was happening right now, in this moment, in this body that was not her own. In a strange way, Ghost was teaching her how to be present again. By the 5th week, he was coming to the fence to eat while she stood nearby. Not close, still 8 or 10 feet of charged air between them, but no longer retreating to the far corner. Progress in the increments that actually hold. Her daughter Sloane came to visit in May and stood on the porch watching Marlowe at the fence. Sloane was 26, lived in Missoula, worked in landscape architecture. She had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness in roughly equal measure, and she had been quietly, persistently worried about Marlowe since the funeral in a way she rarely knew how to express directly. "He's coming closer," Sloane said when Marlowe came back to the porch for coffee. "Slowly. That's still closer." Marlowe looked at her daughter. "Yes," she said, "that's still closer." There was a conversation in that exchange that neither of them made explicit. They were both good at those, at the conversations that happened in the space around the words, rather than in the words themselves. Crispin had been the same way. It was one of the things Marlowe missed most fiercely, the fluency of a shared private language built over years, the ability to say everything important without saying it out loud. Sloane stayed 4 days. She helped with fence repair on the north pasture, cooked 3 dinners, and on her last evening sat with Marlowe on the porch until almost midnight, while the mountains went dark and the stars came out in their cold, extravagant numbers. "You seem different," Sloane said. "Not fixed, just present." "The horse," Marlowe said simply. Sloane nodded. She understood that, or at least understood enough of it. After she left, Marlowe found herself standing at the fence earlier each morning and staying longer, not because she was pushing the process. She had learned enough about traumatized horses to know that pushing was the enemy of everything, but because the fence line had become, quietly and without announcement, the place where she felt most like herself. By the end of May, Ghost would approach the fence while she stood there, not to eat, just to be near. And on one particular morning, still and blue and warm in the particular way that the Montana mountains offer you sometimes like a gift, she held out her hand, flat, at fence height. No food in it, nothing but the gesture itself. Ghost looked at it for a long time, then he stretched his neck toward her, stopped, stretched again, and touched her palm with his nose, barely, the lightest possible contact, a question more than a statement. And Marlowe Dean, who had not cried once since the October Tuesday when everything changed, felt something move through her chest like a wave and had to press her other hand flat against the fence post to keep herself steady. June came in dry, unusually dry, the kind of dry that the older ranchers in Carver's Bluff talked about in low voices at the feed store, comparing it to summers they remembered from decades past, summers that had ended badly. The creek on Marlowe's property dropped earlier than it should have. The grass in the south pasture went yellow by the second week of the month. The air smelled different, lighter, thinner somehow, like something had been removed from it. Marlowe noticed. Cutter called her in the second week of June to check in on Ghost and mentioned it. "Fire season's going to be bad this year," he said. "We haven't had moisture since March. Ground's like paper." "I know," she said. "You got an evacuation plan?" She paused. The honest answer was no, not a real one, not a rehearsed one. She had the general awareness that the mountains around Carver's Bluff were fire country, that any summer could turn serious, that the responsible thing was to think about it. But thinking about it required a particular kind of forward planning that grief had made difficult. Grief is not good at contingency. Grief lives in the past or the immediate present. The future is a room grief doesn't like to enter. "I'll work on it," she told Cutter. Meanwhile, Ghost was changing, not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about what was happening between them, and that was exactly right. But the changes were real and cumulative and visible to anyone paying attention. He no longer circled the far end of the paddock when she arrived in the mornings. He came to the fence when he heard her boots on the gravel path. He had allowed her to touch his nose, then his cheek, then, very slowly, over several sessions, the side of his neck. Each new thing required its own patience, its own separate negotiation. She learned to read the signs of his discomfort, the slight tensing in the muscles behind his ears, the way his weight shifted back, the particular angle of his head that meant this is as far as I go right now. She learned to honor those signs completely, to pull back the moment she saw them, to never push past a boundary he set. Because she understood, with an understanding that went beyond horsemanship into something more personal, that trust rebuilt after betrayal is not the same as trust that was never broken. It is more fragile in some ways, more precious in others. A local man named Ridley stopped by one afternoon. He owned a spread about 5 miles up the valley, ran cattle, kept a few horses of his own. He had known Crispin and had been one of those neighbors who'd offered help in the early months of widowhood, and then, when the help wasn't taken up, had respectfully backed off. He leaned on the fence and watched Ghost for a while. "Heard you took on that Appaloosa from Cutter's place," Ridley said. "I did. Cutter said nobody could do anything with him." "Cutter was working alone and in a hurry," Marlowe said. "I'm neither." Ridley watched Ghost move along the fence line, easy and unhurried. "He looks good," he said. "Looks like he trusts you. He's getting there. How long you been working him?" 2 months. Ridley shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in something closer to admiration. "Crispin would have loved seeing this," he said. "It came out naturally, the way truth does when people stop monitoring themselves," and then he caught himself and glanced at her sideways, worried. But Marlowe didn't flinch. "Yeah," she said, "he would have, and it was okay." That was the thing she noticed. It was okay. Not painless, but okay. Something had shifted in the chemistry of her grief, some long-locked reaction finally moving, and she thought it had something to do with Ghost, with the daily practice of patience and presence, with being required every single morning to show up and try again. She also started sleeping better. That sounds small. It wasn't. The 18 months after Crispin died, she had slept in fragments. An hour here, 2 hours there, waking at 3 in the morning with her hand on his side of the bed, and the whole architecture of the night bearing down on her. Now she was sleeping 5-6 hours at a stretch. The body was coming back online. In the 3rd week of June, she entered the paddock for the first time. Not to approach Ghost, just to be inside the fence, in his space, on his terms. She brought a bucket of feed, set it down in the middle of the paddock, and walked to the far end. She stood there with her back to him, another specific signal, a deliberate lowering of perceived threat, and waited. It took 20 minutes, but he came to the bucket, and while he ate, she turned, slowly, never rushing, and watched him, and he watched her in his peripheral vision, and neither of them required anything of the other. When she left, she latched the gate behind her and stood for a moment with her forehead against the top rail. Her farrier, a quiet young man named Aldous, had come that afternoon to work on the 2 mares. He'd been watching from the barn entrance. "I've never seen that horse let anyone in the paddock," he said. "He didn't let me in," Marlowe said. "He allowed me in. That's different." Aldous thought about that. "What's the difference?" "Permission versus tolerance," she said. "I want permission." July arrived and the valley baked. The creek was barely running now, a trickle along the rocks where in spring it had been generous and loud. The mountains to the east looked different in the heat haze, the tree lines blurred, the ridges wavering. Fire watch alerts had gone out twice already for counties to the north, but so far Carver's Bluff had been spared. Rowena called on the 5th of July, the day after a holiday that Marlowe had spent working because the holiday felt like a day she needed to keep her hands occupied. "You see the smoke to the northeast yesterday?" Rowena asked. "I saw it. That's the Kessler Ridge fire. It's small right now, but the wind forecast for the next week is terrible. I think you need to have a real conversation with yourself about what you're doing if things get bad." Marlowe had begun to have that conversation. She had spoken to the county fire marshal's office and understood the evacuation routes. She had made arrangements with Cutter, who had a larger trailer and more capacity, that if things escalated, he would come and help move animals. She had documented her property with her insurance agent. She had done the responsible adult things, but the truth she hadn't fully faced was this. Moving Ghost in an emergency was not the same as moving the mares. The mares were seasoned, manageable, trained to load. Ghost had never been in a trailer since the day Cutter brought him to her. He associated trailers with the worst transitions of his life. If she needed to get him out fast, under fire conditions, with smoke in the air and adrenaline in both of them, that was a very different proposition. She started working on it, not the trailer itself yet. That was too big a step, but trailer-adjacent things. She brought a large tarp into the paddock and let Ghost get used to it, its sounds and movements and smell. She introduced him to new objects at the edge of his comfort, watching how he handled uncertainty, teaching him that new and strange things didn't automatically mean danger. Aldous came back in mid-July for the mares again and watched her work. "You're desensitizing him," he said. "I'm teaching him that I'll tell him when something is genuinely dangerous," she said. "The rest of the time he can trust my read. You think he'll believe you?" She looked at Ghost, who was watching her from 10 feet away with ears forward, interested, not alarmed. "I think he's starting to." It was during these July sessions that the relationship between them crossed some threshold she hadn't anticipated. She had been in the paddock daily for weeks now, had progressed to touching his neck and shoulder regularly, had begun to brush him, which he had accepted with a tension that slowly, over sessions, released into something that looked almost like pleasure. But one afternoon, during a brushing session in the quiet corner of the paddock, Ghost did something she hadn't expected. He rested his chin on her shoulder, not for long, maybe 5 seconds. Just the weight of his head, settling, acknowledging something, and then he lifted it and looked away as if it hadn't happened. Marlowe stood completely still. She understood in that moment what the past 2 years had been building toward, not just with this horse, with herself. The patience she had developed, the discipline of showing up without agenda, the practice of being present to something outside her own grief, all of it had been reshaping her in ways she hadn't monitored or measured. And this horse, this particular traumatized and extraordinary horse, had been the instrument of that reshaping. She didn't cry then, but she made a sound, a small involuntary exhale, something released from a place she hadn't known was held, and Ghost's ear swiveled toward her, attending to it. "I hear you," the ear said. She drove into town that evening for supplies and stopped at the hardware store, where she ran into a woman named Corinne, who had been in Crispin's hiking group for years. Corinne had one of those faces that always looked like she was deciding whether to say something or not. She said it. "You look different," she told Marlowe at the counter. "Good different, like you came back." Marlowe thought about Ghost's chin on her shoulder. "I think I did," she said. On the drive home, she rolled the windows down and let the hot July air fill the truck cab and thought about what that meant, coming back. Not back to who she was before. That person was gone irrevocably, changed by loss the way a landscape is changed by flood. The shape permanently different, new channels cut, old ones buried. But back to functioning. Back to being a person in the world who could feel things and receive things and participate. She was almost home when she saw the glow on the ridge to the east. Not the sun. The sun was behind her, heading down. This was a different kind of glow, lower, angrier, pulsing slightly at its edges. She pulled the truck over and got out and stood in the road and looked at it. Her phone buzzed. "Rowena, you seeing that?" "I'm seeing it," Marlowe typed back. "It's the Kessler fire. Wind changed direction 2 hours ago. County's putting out early warning for our area. Not evacuation yet, but watch your phone." Marlowe stood in the road for another 30 seconds, watching that glow. Then she got back in the truck and drove home faster than she'd left. She didn't sleep that night. Not because of the old grief insomnia. This was different. This was practical, eyes-open alertness, the kind that the body produces when the situation demands it. She sat on the porch until 2 in the morning, watching the orange bruise on the eastern ridge, tracking whether it was growing. It was growing. At 2:15, she called Cutter. He answered on the second ring, which told her he was awake too. "How many animals can you take?" she asked. No preamble. "I can run 2 trips with my big trailer. First trip tonight if you need it. 4, maybe 5 horses." "I have 3 horses." "The Appaloosa loaded?" A silence. "No." Another silence on his end. "Marlowe, I know. If you get an evacuation order, you're not going to have time to train him onto a trailer." "I know that, Cutter. You need to think about what you do if—" "I know," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I'm thinking about it." She hung up and went to the paddock. Ghost was awake. Horses feel atmospheric change long before humans register it consciously. The shift in air pressure, the smell of smoke still distant but present, the particular quality of a night that is wrong in some way they can't articulate. He was pacing, not in panic, but in the restless, alert way of an animal that knows something is coming and hasn't been told what to do about it. She climbed the fence and sat on the top rail and just talked to him, not commands. Not training language, just her voice in the dark, low and steady, telling him things. She told him about Crispin. She told him about the first winter alone in the farmhouse, the way the silence had physical weight. She told him about the day Cutter called. She told him she was scared right now, and that it was okay because being scared didn't mean you didn't handle things. He stopped pacing. He stood in the middle of the paddock facing her, ears forward, listening. "I need you to trust me," she said. "I have been earning that. I know I have, and I need you to trust me when everything in you is screaming not to." He walked toward her, not in a rush, slowly, with that particular deliberateness that she had come to read as his version of intention. He stopped in front of her and she reached out and put her hand on his forehead and felt the heat of him, the realness of him, the extraordinary improbability of this moment on this night, with fire on the ridge and everything uncertain. "Okay," she said. She went back inside and didn't sleep. At 5 in the morning, the county alert upgraded from early warning to evacuation advisory. One level below mandatory order, meaning be ready to go immediately. She called Rowena. "I'm loading mine in an hour," Rowena said. "You want help?" "Yes." Rowena arrived at 6 with her daughter Genevieve, a capable 20-year-old who had grown up handling horses. They loaded the 2 mares without difficulty, familiar animals who walked onto the trailer with their usual mild complaints and settled quickly. Cutter arrived 40 minutes later with his trailer. The sky to the east was fully orange now. The smell of smoke was no longer a distant suggestion. It was in everything, dense and specific, the kind of smoke that comes from burning forest and carries within it the molecular residue of trees and brush and soil. The horses could smell it with a precision humans couldn't match. The mares were loaded and restless. Ghost was in a different category entirely. He was standing at the far corner of the paddock. Not the panicked bolt and crash of a horse in full fear response. He was holding himself together, but barely. His eyes were showing white at the edges, his nostrils flared wide, his body vibrating with the effort of staying still. Cutter stood next to Marlowe at the paddock fence. Ridley had appeared from somewhere. She hadn't called him, but he'd come anyway, the way people do in these situations in small communities, and he was standing behind them. "Options," Cutter said. "Get him on the trailer," Marlowe said. "Or." She didn't answer that. There was no "or" she was willing to say out loud. "Marlowe." Cutter's voice was careful. "If he won't load, then I'll stay." "That's not..." "Cutter." She turned and looked at him. "Go get the lead rope from the barn, the long one, and the blue halter that's hanging inside the door." He looked at her for a moment. Then he went. The mandatory evacuation order came through at 8:47 in the morning. Marlowe's phone lit up with it at the same moment. The sky, directly overhead, went from hazy to distinctly brown. The smoke reaching them now not as a distant weather event, but as a local reality, arriving in their air, changing the light to something sickly and amber. From the east pasture, they could see the leading edge of flame on the upper ridge, not close enough to feel the heat yet. Close enough to see the individual crowns of trees igniting, one and then another, like something lighting matches in a row. Rowena and Genevieve were in the truck with the mares, engine running, waiting. Ridley was on the fence. Cutter stood beside Marlowe with the lead rope and halter, and Ghost was in the far corner of the paddock, trembling. "I'm going in," Marlowe said. "You want me with you?" Cutter asked. "No, more people makes it worse." She took the halter and rope and looked at Cutter. "If he bolts, don't chase him, stay still." She unlatched the gate and walked in. The smoke smell was thick now. Ash was beginning to fall. Light grey flakes drifting down like the wrong kind of snow, settling on the grass, on the fence posts, on the surface of the water bucket. Ghost's eyes tracked her the moment she was inside the fence. She could see his muscles bunched across his shoulders, the readiness to explode in any direction. She stopped walking. about 20 feet from him. And then she did what she had learned over 4 months to do. She became still, completely, deliberately still. She dropped her energy down, not performing calm, but actually manufacturing it, pulling herself into the present moment with the same discipline she had practiced every morning at this fence. The fire was on the ridge. The smoke was in her lungs. The clock was running. She breathed out, looked at the ground beside Ghost, not at him directly. He was still trembling. She took 3 slow steps toward him, stopped, breathed again. He didn't bolt. She took 3 more steps, and 3 more, until she was close enough to see the reflection of the orange sky in his dark eye, close enough to hear the rapid rhythm of his breathing. "Hey," she said softly. Just that. The same voice she had been using for 4 months in the early morning quiet. The voice he had learned to associate with the absence of demand and the presence of something safe. His ear swiveled toward her. She raised her hand slowly, the same gesture she had used the first morning he touched her palm, and he watched her hand with his whole body tense, every muscle a question. She touched his nose. He shuddered, but he didn't pull back. She moved her hand slowly to his cheek, to his neck, and she leaned her forehead against the side of his head and just breathed. The same thing she did during their good sessions. "This is us. You know this. This is safe." He exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. She slipped the halter over his nose, slowly, and he flinched, but held, buckled it, clipped the lead, and then she began to walk. Not toward the trailer yet, just walking, moving him, getting his feet unstuck from the fear freeze that had rooted him. She walked him in a wide circle in the paddock, keeping her body language loose, her line soft, her voice going continuously. Not commands, just sound, a murmur of reassurance that was less about the words than the frequency of her voice in his ear. From the fence, nobody spoke. Ridley and Cutter stood absolutely still. On the 3rd circle, she angled toward the gate. He felt the direction change, and his body stiffened. He knew the gate, knew that beyond it lay the unknown, and beyond that, somewhere, the thing that smelled of smoke and fire and catastrophic threat. His feet slowed. She didn't pull. She waited. She let the line go slack. "I know," she told him. "I know everything in you is saying no, but I need you to believe me. I need you to trust that I am telling you the truth about what's safe." A piece of ash drifted down between them and landed on his nose. He shook his head, looked at her. She stepped toward the gate, took 1 step through it herself, turned, faced him, and held the lead loose. "Your choice. Come through." From the ridge, there was a sound, a deep, resonant cracking, as another stand of trees went. The sky above the ridge was full orange now, the smoke column enormous, leaning over the valley as the wind pushed it west. Ghost took 1 step forward, then another. He walked through the gate. Marlowe kept walking, steady, rhythmic, not looking back at him, just leading, her footsteps even on the gravel, her voice still going. The trailer was 30 feet away. The ramp was down. Cutter had put feed just inside the trailer door. Ghost slowed as they approached. She felt the hesitation travel up the lead line like a current. She stopped, turned, looked at him. Directly this time, not the soft, unfocused gaze of a training session, but a real look, eye to eye, human to horse. 2 creatures who had been rebuilding trust in each other for 4 months in the early Montana mornings. "I have never lied to you," she said. "Not once." He looked at her for what felt like a very long time. Then he walked up the ramp. Cutter was at the trailer door before Ghost had fully entered, moving quickly and quietly, latching the butt bar, securing the door. Marlowe stood at the side of the trailer with her hand flat against the metal wall and felt his movement inside, heard him shifting. "Go," she said to Cutter. Her voice cracked just slightly. "You riding with me?" he asked. "Yes." She was already walking to the passenger door. Rowena's truck was pulling out of the driveway as they came. Ridley was in his own truck, animals already loaded. Marlowe climbed into the cab and put her hand against the wall behind her head, the thin metal partition between her and Ghost in the trailer. Cutter drove. The road out of the valley went north first, then west, away from the ridge. As they turned onto the main road, Marlowe looked back through the side mirror and watched the orange sky above Carver's Bluff. The farmhouse was still visible from here. The barn, the paddock fence where she had stood every morning. She watched until the valley dropped behind a fold in the land and was gone. They staged at a fairground 17 miles west of Carver's Bluff, a wide, flat property with temporary corrals set up for evacuated livestock, water stations, hay bales, stacked by county emergency management. The parking lot was full of trailers. The air still smelled of smoke, but breathably so, out here at this distance. When Cutter opened the trailer, Ghost came down the ramp and stood in the strange place with his nostrils going, cataloguing everything new. Then he turned and looked at Marlowe. She put her hand on his neck. He didn't move. He just stood there while she held her hand against him. This woman and this horse, both of them outside the thing they'd built and still somehow inside it. Rowena appeared beside her with 2 cups of coffee from a table the emergency volunteers had set up. She handed one to Marlowe without a word and stood there drinking hers, looking at Ghost. "He loaded," Rowena said. "He loaded. In the middle of all that." "In the middle of all that," Marlowe confirmed. Genevieve had taken the mares to a temporary corral at the east end of the property. Ridley had parked nearby and was unloading his animals with the efficient calm of someone who has done emergency evacuations before. People moved around them with the busy purposefulness of crisis management, checking animals, making calls, coordinating. Sloane called at noon. Marlowe answered. "Mom, are you out?" "I'm out. All 3 horses are with me." A sound on the phone that was not quite a word, relief expressed as sound rather than language. "I'm driving up," Sloane said. "You don't need to." "Mom, I'm driving up." Marlowe looked out at the smoky horizon to the east where her valley was. "Okay," she said. "Okay." The fire burned for 9 days. The county sent status updates that Marlowe read on her phone at the fairground, and then at a motel room 6 miles further west, where she stayed with the horses boarded at a nearby facility that had opened its property to evacuees. Cutter stayed in the area too. Ridley went to his brother's place with his animals. Rowena and Genevieve found a farm with space. The community dispersed and regrouped in the way of rural people who have been through this kind of displacement before, practically without too much sentimentality about it. There was too much to manage for sentimentality. Sloane arrived the second afternoon and stayed. She sat in the barn with her mother and Ghost in the evenings, not talking much, just present. One night Marlowe told her the full story of that morning. The paddock, the smoke, the halter, the ramp. Sloane listened to all of it. "What made you sure he would load?" she asked. "I wasn't," Marlowe said. "I was sure I was going to give him every possible chance to, and then deal with whatever happened. That's not certainty, that's something else." "That's what you have when you don't have certainty," Marlowe said. "The fire was declared contained on the 9th day. Carver's Bluff was not destroyed. This is important and worth saying plainly. The valley survived. The fire had burned through approximately 6,000 acres on the eastern ridgeline and taken several structures, including 2 outbuildings on the Kessler property and a barn at a place 3 miles from Marlowe's farm. The fire line had reached to within 1.5 miles of her property before the wind shifted on the 7th day and the crews got ahead of it. When she drove back down the valley road for the first time, she did it slowly. The mountains to the east were black and grey from the ridgeline down, the scorched, skeletal geometry of burned forest, charred trunks still standing, the ground between them ash-covered and desolate in the way that burned land is before it begins to be reborn. The smell was still present, would be present for months, but her farmhouse was standing, the barn, the fences, the creek still barely running, still there. She stood in the driveway for a long time before she went inside. Rowena came by that evening. They stood on the porch together and looked east at the burned ridge in the fading light. "I've seen it come back," Rowena said. "The forest. Give it 2 seasons. It comes back different, but it comes back." "I know," Marlowe said. "The fire's not the end of the story." Marlowe nodded. Ghost was the last to be returned. She waited until the air had cleared enough. The roads were passable, the property assessed. Cutter brought him back on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week that Crispin had died, though she didn't register this until later, and when she did, it didn't feel like coincidence so much as like something the universe was annotating. Ghost came down the trailer ramp and stood in the familiar gravel yard and breathed in his home. Then he looked at Marlowe and walked to her, not to the fence, not to the paddock gate, to her directly in the open yard. He lowered his head to her shoulder, not the hesitant chin rest of that first time, but a deliberate, settled, full resting of his head, and stayed there. Cutter, standing by his truck, made a sound under his breath that might have been a word, or might have just been something he needed to release. Marlowe stood with Ghost's head on her shoulder and both her hands on his neck, and looked at the burned ridge and the sky above it. Blue, the first fully blue sky in 10 days. And felt the whole weight of what the last 2 years had been in her chest, felt it not as the crushing inward pressure of grief, but as something that had become part of her structure. Grief transmuted into something denser and more load-bearing, into the particular quiet strength that comes from having been broken and having rebuilt. She was 51 years old. She was a widow. She was standing in her yard with a horse who had chosen her in the middle of a wildfire. Ridley came by that afternoon with supplies, offered wordlessly, left without expectation. Aldous stopped in the next week to check the mare's hooves and spent an extra hour just because, he said, he'd been worried. Corinne called from town. Sloane called every day for the first week, then every other day, then settled into a frequency that was simply more than before, a recalibration of closeness that the crisis had made possible. The burned ridge began almost immediately to show the first signs of what fire ecologists call post-fire regeneration. The green shoots coming up through the ash, the improbable, unstoppable insistence of living things on continuing to be alive. Marlowe noticed this. She noticed it the way she noticed everything now, with the particular quality of attention that Ghost had taught her. Full presence, nothing held back. Taking in what was actually here rather than what was lost. I want to leave you with something. There is a kind of bravery that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look like the bravery in movies. Not fast, not loud, not backed by a soundtrack. It looks like standing at a fence every single morning when nothing is happening. It looks like going back the next day and the day after that. It looks like the slow, daily, unremarkable practice of not giving up on something that hasn't given you a reason to keep going yet. Marlowe Dean didn't survive a wildfire because she was fearless. She survived it, and so did Ghost, because she had spent 4 months building something strong enough to hold under the worst possible conditions. That's what trust is. That's what healing is. It isn't the dramatic moment when everything comes together. It is every quiet morning, before that moment, every small patient step, every time you showed up when you didn't have to. The fire came, the fire passed, and on the other side of it, there was a woman and a horse standing in a yard under a blue sky, both of them still here, both of them different, both of them, finally, improbably stubbornly, home. If this story moved something in you today, I want to know about it. Leave a comment. Tell me what part stayed with you. Tell me where you're watching from. I genuinely love knowing who's out there on the other side of this. Hit that like button if you believe that trust built slowly is the strongest kind. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, real, human, the kind that remind us why any of this matters. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next one.